The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 3, by Will Durant, concluded. In the fourth gulf of the eighth circle are those who presumed to foretell the future. Their heads are fixed face backward on their necks. From a bridge, Malebolge, over the fifth gulf, they look down upon public peculators, who swim forever in a lake of boiling pitch. Hypocrites pass continually around the sixth gulf, wearing gilded cloaks of lead. Along the only pathway in that gulf lies Caiaphas, prostrate and crucified, so that all who pass must tread upon his flesh. In the seventh gulf, robbers are tormented by venomous snakes. Dante recognizes here several Florentines. From an arch over the eighth gulf, he sees flames consuming and reconsuming evil counselors. Here is the wily Odysseus. In the ninth gulf, scandalmongers and schismatics are torn limb from limb. Here is Mohammed, described with appalling ferocity. As one I marked, torn from the chin throughout, down to the hinder passage, twixt the legs dangling his entrails hung. The midriff lay open to view, and wretched ventricle that turns the unglutted aliment to dross. Whilst eager I fixed on him my gaze, he eyed me, with his hands laid his breast bare, and cried, "Now mark how I do rip me, lo! And is Mohammed mangled? Before me walks Ali weeping, from the chin his face cleft to the forelock, and the others all whom here thou seest, while they live, did sow scandal and schism, and therefore thus are rent. A friend is here behind, who with his sword hacks us thus cruelly, slivering again each of us this ream when we have compassed round the dismal way. For first our gashes close ere we repass him." In the 10th gulf of the 8th circle lie forgers, counterfeiters, and alchemists, moaning with varied ailments. A stench of sweat and pus fills the air, and the groans of the sufferers make a terrifying roar. At last, the poets reach the 9th and lowest circle of hell, which, strange to relate, is a vast well of ice. Here traitors are buried in the ice to their chins. Tears of pain freeze into a crystalline visor over their faces. Count Ugolino della Gherardesca, who betrayed Pisa, is here eternally bound to Archbishop Ruggieri, who imprisoned him with his sons and grandsons and allowed them all to starve to death. Now Ugolino's head lies upon the archbishop's, which it chews forever. At Nadir, the center of the earth and the very bottom of the narrowing funnel of hell, the giant Lucifer lies buried to the waist in ice, flapping enormous wings from his shoulders, weeping icy tears of blood from the 3 faces that divide his head, and chewing a traitor in each of 3 jaws, Brutus, Cassius, and Judas. Half the terrors of the medieval soul are gathered into this gory chronicle. As one reads its awful pages, the gruesome horror mounts, until at last the cumulative effect is oppressive and overwhelming. Not all the sins and crimes of man from nebula to nebula could match the sadistic fury of this divine revenge. Dante's conception of hell is the crowning indecency of medieval theology. Classic antiquity had thought of a Hades or Avernus that received all the human dead into a subterranean and indiscriminate darkness, but it had not pictured that Tartarus as a place of torture. Centuries of barbarism, insecurity, and war had to intervene before man could defile his God with attributes of undying vengeance and inexhaustible cruelty. With relief we learn at the end that Virgil and Dante have passed through the center of the earth, have inverted the direction of their heads and feet, and are moving upward toward the Antipodes. With the time-disdaining swiftness of a dream, the 2 poets traverse in 2 days the diameter of the earth. They emerge in the southern hemisphere on Easter morning, drink in the light of day, and stand at the foot of the terraced mountain which is Purgatory. 3. Purgatory. The conception of purgatory is by comparison humane. Man may by effort and pain, by hope and vision, cleanse himself of sin and selfishness and mount step by step to understanding, love, and bliss. So Dante pictures purgatory as a mountainous cone divided into 9 levels, an anti-purgatory, 7 terraces, 1 for the purgation of each of the deadly sins, and at the summit the earthly paradise. From each level the sinner moves with diminishing pain to a higher level, and at each ascent an angel chants one of the Beatitudes. In the lower stages there are stern punishments for sins shriven and forgiven but not yet atoned for with sufficient penalty. Nevertheless, as against hell's bitter consciousness that suffering will never end, There is here the strengthening certainty that after finite punishment will come an eternity of happiness. A softer mood and a brightening light pervade these cantos, and reveal a Dante learning mildness from his pagan guide. Virgil, with daubs of dew, washes from Dante's face the sweat and grime of hell. The sea surrounding the mountain shimmers under the rising sun, as the sin-darkened soul trembles with joy at the coming of divine grace. Here, on the first level, in accord with Thomas's hope that some good heathen might be saved, Dante encounters Cato of Utica, the stern, stiff Stoic who, rather than suffer Caesar's mercy, killed himself. Here, too, is Manfred, Frederick's son, who fought a pope but loved poetry. Virgil hurries Dante onward with oft-quoted lines. Lascia di la gente, sta come torre ferma che non crolla giammai la cima per soffiar di venti. Let the people talk. Stand like a firm tower which never shakes its top for all the blowing of the winds. Virgil is not at home in purgatory. He cannot answer Dante's questions as readily as in his wonted hell. He feels his lack, and shows at times an irritated wistfulness. He is comforted when they meet Sordello. The poet sons of Mantua fall into each other's arms, united by the Italian's affection for the city of his youth. Thereupon Dante breaks out into a bitter apostrophe to his country, summarizing his essay on the need of monarchy. Ah, slavish Italy, thou inn of grief! Vessel without a pilot in loud storm, lady no longer of fair provinces, but brothel house impure. This gentle spirit, even from the pleasant sound of his dear land, was prompt to greet a fellow citizen with such glad cheer. While now thy living ones in thee abide not without war, and one malicious gnaws another, aye, of those whom the same wall and the same moat contain. Seek, wretched one, around thy sea-coasts wide, then homeward to thy bosom turn, and mark if any part of thee sweet peace enjoy. What boots it that for thee Justinian the bridle mend, if empty be the saddle? Ah, people that devoted still should be, and in the saddle let thy Caesar sit, if well thou mark'st that which God commands. And as if to point his fondness for kings that can hold a steady reign, he tells how Sordello guides them, at the base of the Purgatorial Mount, to a lovely sunny valley, flower-strewn and fragrant, where dwell the Emperor Rudolph, King Ottokar of Bohemia, Peter III of Aragon, Henry II of England, Philip III of France. Conducted by Lucia, symbolizing the light of God's grace, Dante and Virgil are admitted by an angel to the first terrace of Purgatory. Here the proud are punished by carrying on their bent backs each a massive stone, while reliefs on wall and pavement picture famous deeds of humility and the dire results of pride. On the second terrace, the envious, clad in sackcloth, have their eyes repeatedly sewn up with iron threads. On the third terrace, anger. On the fourth, sloth. On the fifth, avarice, endure their appropriate penalties. Here Pope Hadrian V, once covetous of wealth, does penance peacefully, calm in the surety of ultimate salvation. In one of the many delightful episodes that brighten the Purgatorio, the Roman poet Statius appears and greets the travelers with such joy as seldom moves a poet meeting another poet on the earth. Together the three mount to the sixth terrace, where the sin of gluttony is cleansed. Trees dangle sweet-smelling fruit before the penitents, but withdraw them when hands reach out to grasp, while voices in the air recount historic feats of temperance. On the seventh and last terrace are those who sinned by incontinence, but were shriven before death. They are gently singed and purified by flames. Dante has a poet's sympathy for sins of the flesh, above all when committed by persons of artistic temperament, and therefore especially sensitive, imaginative, and precipitous. Here is Guido Guinizelli. Dante hails him as Pater in Litteris, and thanks him for sweet songs, which, as long as our language lasts, will make us love the very ink that traced them. An angel guides them through fire by the last ascent into the earthly paradise. Here Virgil bids him farewell. My ken no farther reaches. I with skill and art thus far have drawn thee. Now thy pleasure take for guide. Lo, the sun that darts his beam upon thy forehead. Lo, the herb, the arborets and flowers, which of itself this land pours forth profuse. Till those bright eyes with gladness come, which, weeping, made me haste to succor thee, thou mayest or seat thee down, or wander where thou wilt. Expect no more sanction of warning voice or sign from me. Free of thine own arbitrament to choose, discreet, judicious, I invest thee then with crown and mitre, sovereign o'er thyself. Virgil and Statius now behind instead of before him, Dante wanders through the woods and fields, and along the streams of the earthly paradise, breathing the pleasant odor of its pure air, hearing from the trees the songs of feathered choristers chanting prime. A lady culling flowers stops her singing to explain to him why this fair country is deserted. It was once the Garden of Eden, but man's disobedience exiled him and mankind from its innocent delights. To this forfeited paradise Beatrice descends from heaven, clothed in such blinding radiance that Dante can only feel her presence but not see it. Albeit my eyes discerned her not, there moved a hidden virtue from her, at whose touch the power of ancient love was strong within me. He turns to address his poet guide, but Virgil has returned to the limbo from which the summons of Beatrice had drawn him. Dante weeps, but Beatrice bids him mourn rather the sins of lust with which, after her death, he tarnished her image in his soul. Indeed, she tells him, that dark wood, from which through Virgil she has rescued him, was the life of incontinence, wherein, at the midpoint of his years, he had found himself lost, with the right road dimmed. Dante falls to the ground in shame and confesses his sins. Celestial virgins come and intercede with the offended Beatrice, and beg her to reveal to him her second and spiritual beauty. Not that she has forgotten the first. Never didst thou spy in art or nature aught so passing sweet as were the limbs that in their beauteous frame enclosed me, and are scattered now in dust. She relents, and shows her new celestial beauty, but the virgins warn Dante not to gaze upon her directly, but only to look at her feet. Beatrice leads him and Statius, who has completed after 12 centuries his term in purgatory, to a fountain from which issue 2 streams, Lethe, forgetfulness, and Eunoe, good understanding. Dante drinks of Eunoe and is cleansed, and now regenerate is made apt for mounting to the stars. It is not true that the Inferno is the only interesting part of the Divine Comedy. There are many arid didactic passages in the Purgatorio, and always a ballast of theology. But in this canticle the poem, freed from the horrors of damnation, mounts step by step in beauty and tenderness, cheers the ascent with nature's loveliness regained, and faces bravely the task of making the disembodied Beatrice beautiful. Through her again, as in his youth, Dante enters paradise. 4. Heaven. Dante's theology made his task harder. Had he allowed himself to picture paradise in Persian or Mohammedan style, as a garden of physical as well as spiritual delights, his sensuous nature would have found abundant imagery. But how can that constitutional materialist, the human intellect, conceive a heaven of purely spiritual bliss? Moreover, Dante's philosophical development forbade him to represent God or the angels and saints of heaven in anthropomorphic terms. Rather, he visions them as forms and points of light, and the resultant abstractions lose in a luminous void the life and warmth of sinful flesh. But Catholic doctrine professed the resurrection of the body, and Dante, while struggling to be spiritual, endows some denizens of heaven with corporeal features and human speech. It is pleasant to learn that even in heaven, Beatrice has beautiful feet. His plan of paradise is worked out with impressive consistency, brilliant imagination, and bold detail. Following Ptolemaic astronomy, he thinks of the heavens as an expanding series of 9 hollow crystal spheres revolving about the earth. These spheres are the many mansions of the Father's house. In each sphere, a planet and a multitude of stars are set like gems in a diadem. As they move, these celestial bodies, all endowed in gradation with divine intelligence, sing the joy of their blessedness and the praise of their Creator, and bathe the heavens in the music of the spheres. The stars, says Dante, are the saints of heaven, the souls of the saved, and according to the merits that they earned in life, so differently high is their station above the earth, so loftier is their happiness, so nearer are they to that empyrean, which is above all the spheres and holds the throne of God. As if drawn by the light that radiates from Beatrice, Dante rises from the earthly paradise to the first circle of the heavens, which is that of the moon. There are the souls of those who by no fault of their own were forced to violate their religious vows. One such, Picardo Donati, explains to Dante that though they are in the lowest circle of the heavens and enjoy a degree of bliss less than that of the spirits above them, they are freed by the divine wisdom from all envy, longing, or discontent. For the essence of happiness lies in the joyful acceptance of the divine will. La sua volontate è nostra pace. His will is our peace. This is the basic line of the Divine Comedy. Subject to a celestial magnetism that draws all things to God, Dante rises with Beatrice to the second heaven, which is the sphere dominated by the planet Mercury. Here are those who on earth were absorbed in practical activity to good ends, but were more intent on worldly honor than on serving God. Justinian appears and phrases in royal lines the historic functions of the Roman Empire and Roman law. Through him Dante strikes another blow for one world under one law and king. Beatrice leads the poet to the third heaven, the circle of Venus, where the Provençal bard Folk foretells the tragedy of Boniface VIII. In the fourth heaven, whose orb is the sun, Dante finds the Christian philosophers, Boethius, Isidore of Seville, Bede, Peter Lombard, Gratian, Albertus Magnus, Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventura, and Sige de Brabant. In a gracious exchange, Thomas the Dominican relates to Dante the life of St. Francis, and Bonaventura the Franciscan tells him the story of St. Dominic. Thomas, always a man and mind of some expanse, clogs the narrative with discourses on theological subtleties, and Dante is so anxious to be a philosopher that for several cantos he ceases to be a poet. Beatrice leads him to the fifth heaven, that of Mars, where are the souls of warriors who died fighting for the true faith: Joshua, Judas Maccabeus, Charlemagne, even Robert Guiscard, ravager of Rome. They are arranged as thousands of stars in the form of a dazzling cross and the figure of the crucified. And every star in the luminous emblem joins in a celestial harmony. Ascending to the sixth heaven, that of Jupiter, Dante finds those who on earth administer justice equitably. Here are David, Hezekiah, Constantine, Trajan, another pagan breaking into heaven. These living stars are arranged in the form of an eagle. They speak with one voice, discoursing to Dante on theology and celebrating the praise of just kings. Mounting what Beatrice figuratively calls the stairway of the eternal palace, the poet and his guide reach the seventh heaven of delight, the planet Saturn and its attendant stars. At every ascent the beauty of Beatrice takes on new brilliance, as if enhanced by the rising splendor of each higher sphere. She dares not smile upon her lover, lest he be consumed to ashes in her radiance. This is the circle of monks who live in piety and fidelity to their vows. Peter Damian is among them. Dante asks him how to reconcile man's freedom with God's foresight and consequent predestination. Peter replies that even the most enlightened souls in heaven under God cannot answer his question. St. Benedict appears and mourns the corruption of his monks. Now the poet floats upward from the circles of the planets to the eighth heaven, the zone of the fixed stars. From the constellation Gemini he looks down and sees the infinitesimal earth, so pitiful of semblance that it moved my smiles. A moment of homesickness, even for that miserable planet, might have moved him then, but a glance from Beatrice tells him that this heaven of light and love, and not that scene of sin and strife, is his proper home. Canto 23 opens with one of Dante's characteristic similes. Even as the bird who midst the leafy bower has in her nest sat darkly through the night with her sweet brood, impatient to descry their wished looks and to bring home their food, in the fond quest unconscious of her toil, she of the time prevenient, on the spray that overhangs their couch, with wakeful gaze expects the sun, nor ever till the dawn removeth from the east her eager ken. So Beatrice fixes her eyes in one direction expectantly. Suddenly the heavens there shine with startling splendor. "Behold," cries Beatrice, "the triumphant hosts of Christ, souls new won for paradise." Dante looks, but sees only a light so full and strong that he is blinded, and cannot tell what passes by. Beatrice bids him open his eyes. Now, she says, he can endure her full radiance. She smiles upon him, and it is, he swears, an experience that can never be cancelled from his memory. "Why doth my face enamour thee?" she asks, and bids him rather look at Christ and Mary and the apostles. He tries to make them out, but sees merely legions of splendors, on whom burning rays shed lightnings from above, while to his ears comes the music of the Regina Coeli, sung by heavenly hosts. Christ and Mary ascend, but the apostles remain behind, and Beatrice asks them to speak to Dante. Peter questions him about his faith, is pleased with his replies, and agrees with him that as long as Boniface is pope, the apostolic see is vacant or defiled. There is no mercy in Dante for Boniface. The apostles vanish upward, and Dante mounts at last, with her who hath imparadised my soul, into the ninth and highest heaven. Here in the Empyrean there are no stars, only pure light, and the spiritual, incorporeal, uncaused, motionless source of all souls, bodies, causes, motions, light, and life, God. The poet struggles now to achieve the beatific vision, but all he sees is a point of light about which revolve 9 circles of pure intelligences, seraphim, cherubim, thrones, dominions, virtues, powers, principalities, archangels, and angels. Through these, his agents and emissaries, the Almighty governs the world. But though Dante cannot perceive the divine essence, he beholds all the hosts of heaven forming themselves into a luminous rose, a marvel of shimmering lights and diverse hues expanding leaf by leaf into a gigantic flower. Beatrice leaves her lover now and takes her place in the rose. He sees her seated on her individual throne and prays her still to help him. She smiles down upon him and thereafter fixes her gaze upon the center of all light. But she sends St. Bernard to aid and comfort him. Bernard directs Dante's eyes to the Queen of Heaven. The poet looks, but discerns only a flaming luster surrounded by thousands of angels clothed in light. Bernard tells him that if he would obtain power to see the heavenly vision more clearly, he must join with him in prayer to the Mother of God. The final canto opens with Bernard's melodious supplication. Vergine Madre, filia del tuo figlio, umile ed alta più che creatura. Virgin Mother, daughter of thy Son, more humble and exalted than any creature. Bernard begs her of her grace to enable Dante's eyes to behold the divine majesty. Beatrice and many saints bend toward Mary with hands clasped in prayer. Mary looks for a moment benignly upon Dante, then turns her eyes upon the everlasting light. Now, says the poet, my vision, becoming pure, more and more entered the ray of that high light which in itself is truth. What else he saw remains, he says, beyond all human speech and fantasy. But in that abyss of radiance, clear and lofty, seemed, methought, 3 orbs of triple hue combined in one. The majestic epic ends with Dante's gaze still fixed upon that radiance, drawn and impelled by the love that moves the sun and all the stars. The Divine Comedy is the strangest and most difficult of all poems. No other, before yielding its treasures, makes such imperious demands. Its language is the most compact and concise this side of Horace and Tacitus. It gathers into a word or phrase contents and subtleties requiring a rich background and an alert intelligence for full apprehension. Even the wearisome theological, psychological, astronomical disquisitions have here a pithy precision that only a scholastic philosopher could rival or enjoy. Dante lived so intensely in his time that his poem almost breaks under the weight of contemporary allusions unintelligible today without a litter of notes obstructing the movement of the tale. He loved to teach and tried to pour into one poem nearly all that he had ever learned, with the result that the living verse lies abed with dead absurdities. He weakens the charm of Beatrice by making her the voice of his political loves and hates. He stops his story to denounce 100 cities or groups or individuals, and at times his epic founders in a sea of vituperation. He adores Italy, but Bologna is full of panders and pimps, Florence is the favorite product of Lucifer, Pistoia is a den of beasts, Genoa is full of corruption, and as for Pisa, a curse upon Pisa! May the Arno be damned at its mouth and drown all Pisa, man and mouse, beneath its raging waters. Dante thinks that supreme wisdom and primal love created hell. He promises to remove the ice for a moment from the eyes of Alberigo, if the latter will tell his name and story. Alberigo does, and asks fulfillment. Reach hither now thy hand, open thy eyes. But, says Dante, I opened them not for him. To be rude to him was courtesy. If a man so bitter could win a conducted tour through paradise, we shall all be saved. His poem is nonetheless the greatest of medieval Christian books, and one of the greatest of all time. The slow accumulation of its intensity through 100 cantos is an experience that no thorough reader will ever forget. It is, as Carlyle said, the sincerest of poems. There is no pretense in it, no hypocrisy or false modesty, no sycophancy or cowardice. The most powerful men of the age, even a pope who claimed all power, are attacked with a force and fervor unparalleled in poetry. Above all, there is here a flight and sustainment of imagination challenging Shakespeare's supremacy. Vivid pictures of things never seen by gods or men, descriptions of nature that only an observant and sensitive spirit could achieve, and little narratives like Francesca's or Ugolino's but press great tragedies into narrow space with yet no vital matter missed. There is no humor in this man, but love was there till misfortune turned it into theology. What Dante achieves at last is sublimity. We cannot find in his epic the Mississippi of life and action that is the Iliad, nor the gentle, drowsy stream of Virgil's verse, nor the universal understanding and forgiveness of Shakespeare. But here is grandeur, and the tortured, half-barbaric force that foreshadows Michelangelo. And because Dante loved order as well as liberty, and bound his passion and vision into form, he achieved a poem of such sculptured power that no man since has equaled it. Through the centuries that followed him, Italy revered him as the liberator of her golden speech. Petrarch and Boccaccio and 100 others were inspired by his battle and his art, and all Europe rang with the story of the proud exile who had gone to hell and had returned and had never smiled again. Epilogue: The Medieval Legacy. It is fitting that we should end our long and devious narrative with Dante, for in the century of his death those men appeared who would begin to destroy the majestic edifice of faith and hope in which he had lived. Wycliffe and Huss would preface the Reformation, Giotto and Chrysoloras, Petrarch and Boccaccio would proclaim the Renaissance. In the history of man, so multiple is he and diverse, one mood may survive in some souls and places long after its successor or opposite has risen in other minds or states. In Europe, the age of faith reached its last full flower in Dante. It suffered a vital wound from Occam's razor in the 14th century, but it lingered, ailing, till the advent of Bruno and Galileo, Descartes and Spinoza, Bacon and Hobbes. It may return if the age of reason achieves catastrophe. Great areas of the world remained under the rule and sign of faith while Western Europe sailed reason's uncharted seas. The Middle Ages are a condition, as well as a period. In Western Europe, we should close them with Columbus. In Russia, they continued till Peter the Great, who died in 1725. In India, till our time. We are tempted to think of the Middle Ages as a fallow interval between the fall of the Roman Empire in the West in 476 and the discovery of America. We must remind ourselves that the followers of Abelard called themselves Moderni, and that the Bishop of Exeter in 1287 spoke of his century as Moderni Tempores, modern times. The boundary between medieval and modern is always advancing, and our age of coal and oil and sooty slums may someday be accounted medieval by an era of cleaner power and more gracious life. The Middle Ages were no mere interlude between one civilization and another. If we date them from Rome's acceptance of Christianity and the Council of Nicaea, A.D. 325, they include the final centuries of the classic culture, the ripening of Catholic Christianity into a full and rich civilization in the 13th century, and the breakup of that civilization into the opposed cultures of the Renaissance and the Reformation. The men of the Middle Ages were the victims of barbarism, then the conquerors of barbarism, then the creators of a new civilization. It would be unwise to look down with Hebritic pride upon a period that produced so many great men and women, and raised from the ruins of barbarism the papacy, the European states, and the hard-won wealth of our medieval heritage. That legacy included evil as well as good. We have not fully recovered from the Dark Ages, the insecurity that excites greed, the fear that fosters cruelty, the poverty that breeds filth and ignorance, the filth that generates disease, the ignorance that begets credulity, superstition, occultism. These still survive amongst us, and the dogmatism that festers into intolerance and inquisitions only awaits opportunity or permission to oppress, kill, ravage, and destroy. In this sense, modernity is a cloak put upon medievalism, which secretly remains. And in every generation, civilization is the laborious product and precarious obligating privilege of an engulfed minority. The Inquisition left its evil mark on European society. It made torture a recognized part of legal procedure, and it drove men back from the adventure of reason into a fearful and stagnant conformity. The preponderant bequest of the Age of Faith was religion, a Judaism absorbed till the 18th century in the Talmud, a Mohammedanism becalmed after the victory of the Quran over philosophy in the 12th century, a Christianity divided between East and West, between North and South, and yet the most powerful and influential religion in the white man's history. The creed of the medieval church is today, in 1950, cherished by 330 million Roman, 128 million Orthodox Catholics. Her liturgy still moves the soul after every argument has failed. And the work of the Church in education, charity, and the moral taming of barbaric man left to modernity a precious fund of social order and moral discipline. The papal dream of a united Europe faded in the strife of empire and papacy, but every generation is stirred by a kindred vision of an international moral order superior to the jungle ethics of sovereign states. When that papal dream broke, the nations of Europe took essentially the form that they retained till our century, and the principle of nationality prepared to write the political history of modern times. Meanwhile, the medieval mind created great systems of civil and canon law, maritime and mercantile codes, charters of municipal freedom, the jury system and habeas corpus, and the Magna Carta of the aristocracy. Courts and curias, prepared for states and church, modes and mechanisms of administration employed to this day. Representative government appeared in the Spanish Cortes, the Icelandic Althing, the French État Général, the English Parliament. Greater still was the economic heritage. The Middle Ages conquered the wilderness, won the great war against forest, jungle, marsh, and sea, and yoked the soil to the will of man. Over most of Western Europe they ended slavery and almost ended serfdom. They organized production into guilds that even now enter into the ideals of economists seeking a middle way between the irresponsible individual and the autocratic state. Tailors, cobblers, and dressmakers, until our own time, practiced their handicrafts in personal shops after the medieval fashion. Their submission to large-scale production and capitalistic organization has occurred under our eyes. The great fairs that now and then gather men and goods in modern cities are a legacy of medieval trade. So are our efforts to check monopoly and regulate prices and wages. And nearly all the processes of modern banking were inherited from medieval finance. Even our fraternities and secret societies have medieval roots and rights. Medieval morality was the heir of barbarism and the parent of chivalry. Our idea of the gentleman is a medieval creation, and the chivalric ideal, however removed from knightly practice, has survived as one of the noblest conceptions of the human spirit. Perhaps the worship of Mary brought new elements of tenderness into the behavior of European man. If later centuries advanced upon medieval morality, it was on a medieval foundation of family unity, moral education, and slowly spreading habits of honor and courtesy, much as the moral life of modern skeptics may be an afterglow of the Christian ethic absorbed in youth. The intellectual legacy of the Middle Ages is poorer than our Hellenic inheritance, and is alloyed with 1,000 occult perversions mostly stemming from antiquity. Even so, it includes the modern languages, the universities, and the terminology of philosophy and science. Scholasticism was a training in logic rather than a lasting philosophical conquest, though it still dominates 1,000 colleges. The assumptions of medieval faith hampered historiography. Men thought they knew the origin and destiny of the world and man, and wove a web of myth that almost imprisoned history within the walls of monastic chronicles. It is not quite true that medieval historians had no notion of development or progress. The 13th century, like the 19th, was powerfully impressed by its own achievements. Nor were the Middle Ages as static as we once proudly supposed. Distance immobilizes motion, assimilates differences, and freezes change. But change was as insistent then as now, in manners and dress, language and ideas, law and government, commerce and finance, literature and art. Medieval thinkers, however, did not attach as much importance as the modern thoughtless to progress in means unaccompanied by improvement in ends. The scientific legacy of the Middle Ages is modest indeed, yet it includes the Hindu numerals, the decimal system, the conception of experimental science, substantial contributions to mathematics, geography, astronomy, and optics, the discovery of gunpowder, the invention of eyeglasses, the mariner's compass, the pendulum clock, and, apparently the most indispensable of all, the distillation of alcohol. Arabic and Jewish physicians advanced Greek medicine, and Christian pioneers emancipated surgery from the tonsorial arts. Half the hospitals of Europe are medieval foundations, or modern restorations of medieval establishments. Modern science has inherited the internationalism, and in part the international language, of medieval thought. Next to moral discipline, the richest portion of our medieval heritage is in art. The Empire State Building is as sublime as Chartres Cathedral, and owes its grandeur to architecture alone, to the stability of its audacious height and the purity of its functional lines. But the union of sculpture, painting, poetry, and music with architecture in the life of a Gothic cathedral gives to Chartres, Amiens, Reims, and Notre Dame a scope and depth of sensuous and spiritual harmony, a wealth and diversity of content and ornament that never lets our interest sleep and more fully fills the soul. These portals, towers, and spires, these vaults that made a soaring counterpoint of stone, these statues, altars, fonts, and tombs so fondly carved, these windows that rivaled the rainbow and chastened the sun, one must forgive much to an age that loved so conscientiously the symbols of its faith and the work of its hands. It was for the cathedrals that polyphonic music was developed, and musical notation and staff, and from the church the modern drama was born. The medieval heritage in literature, though it cannot vie in quality with that of Greece, may bear comparison with Rome's. Dante may stand beside Virgil, Petrarch beside Horace, the love poetry of the Arabs and the troubadours beside Ovid, Tibullus, and Propertius. The Arthurian romances are deeper and nobler than anything in the Metamorphoses or the Heroides, and as graceful. And the major medieval hymns top the finest lyrics of Roman poetry. The 13th century ranks with the age of Augustus or of Leo X. Rarely has any century seen so full and varied an intellectual or artistic flowering. A commercial expansion almost as vigorous as that which marked the close of the 15th century, enlarged, enriched, and aroused the world. Strong popes from Innocent III to Boniface VIII made the Church for a century the summit of European order and law. St. Francis dared to be a Christian. The mendicant orders restored the monastic ideal. Great statesmen like Philip Augustus, St. Louis, Philip IV, Edward I, Frederick II, Alfonso X raised their states from custom to law and their peoples to new medieval levels of civilization. Triumphing over the mystical tendencies of the 12th century, the 13th sallied forth into philosophy and science with a zest and courage not surpassed by the Renaissance. In literature, the wonderful century ran the gamut from Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival to the conception of the Divine Comedy. Nearly all elements of medieval civilization seemed in that century to reach unity, maturity, and culminating form. We shall never do justice to the Middle Ages until we see the Italian Renaissance not as their repudiation, but as their fulfillment. Columbus and Magellan continued the explorations already far advanced by the merchants and navigators of Venice, Genoa, Marseille, Barcelona, Lisbon, and Cadiz. The same spirit that had stirred the 12th century gave pride in battle to the cities of Renaissance Italy. The same energy and vitality of character that marked Enrico Dandolo, Frederick II, and Gregory IX consumed the men of the Renaissance. The condottieri stemmed from Robert Guiscard, the despots from Ezzelino and Pallavicino. The painters walked in the paths opened by Cimabue and Duccio, and Palestrina mediated between Gregorian chant and Bach. Petrarch was the heir of Dante and the troubadours. Boccaccio was an Italian trouvère. Despite Don Quixote, romance continued to flourish in Renaissance Europe, and Chrétien de Troyes came to perfection in Malory. The revival of letters had begun in the medieval schools. What distinguished the Renaissance was that it extended the revival from Latin to Greek classics and rejected Gothic to revive Greek art. But Greek sculpture had already been accepted as a model by Niccolo Pisano in the 13th century, and when Chrysoloras brought the Greek language and classics to Italy in 1393, the Middle Ages had still a century to run. In Renaissance Italy, Spain, and France, the same religion held sway that had built the cathedrals and composed the hymns, with only this difference, that the Italian Church, sharing richly in the culture of the time, gave to the Italian mind a freedom of thought born in the medieval universities, and predicated on the tacit understanding that philosophers and scientists would pursue their work without attempting to destroy the faith of the people. So it was that Italy and France did not share in the Reformation. They moved from the Catholic culture of the 13th century to the humanism of the 15th and 16th, and thence to the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th. It was this continuity, combined with pre-Columbian Mediterranean trade, that gave to the Latin peoples a temporary cultural advantage over northern nations more severely ravaged by religious wars. That continuity went back through the Middle Ages to classic Rome, and through southern Italy to classic Greece. Through Greek colonies in Sicily, Italy, and France, through the Roman conquest and Latinization of France and Spain, one magnificent thread of culture ran from Sappho and Anacreon to Virgil and Horace, to Dante and Petrarch, to Rabelais and Montaigne, to Voltaire and Anatole France. In passing from the Age of Faith to the Renaissance, we shall be advancing from the uncertain childhood to the lusty and exhilarating youth of a culture that married classic grace to barbaric strength and transmitted to us, rejuvenated and enriched, that heritage of civilization to which we must always add, but which we must never let die. Thank you again, friend reader. This concludes the reading of The Age of Faith by Will Durant. This book was read by Alexander Adams. Additional titles by Will Durant in the Books on Tape library include Our Oriental Heritage and The Life of Greece. For additional information about them or for help with topics of related interest, please call our customer service department or check our catalog index to find review material. This audiobook may be purchased by you and donated to your local library for your friends and neighbors to enjoy. Such a donation qualifies as a write-off for tax purposes. Books on Tape Incorporated produces many new unabridged audiobook titles each month. Please call our friendly operators toll-free at 1-800-88-BOOKS for information about our service or to set up a library donation or to speed your next title to you without delay. Will you please wind or rewind the tape as appropriate so the book will be in order for the next person to enjoy? Thank you.